I mean, that would be the real kind of not so modest ambition. But you know, that's I mean, Benjamin's Arcades project is also a very performative text. I mean, it's not simply a single text. It's many different voices and many different stories existing simultaneously, connected by various thematic convolutes. So time and place, connecting together the temporal or the non-simultaneous together with the layers. Zeitschichten, or thinking about Geschichte, history, as spatial. Thinking about the spatial components or the place-based components to history. Entering into a city space like a flaneur does, walking down a street and being conducted downward in time. That was the original thinking behind Hypermedia Berlin. And this thought happened when this project, and you can read about the project here, I'm not going to launch the whole thing, but on the vector slate. The project originated in 2000 at the Stanford Humanities Laboratory, where I was finishing a PhD in comparative literature there. And institutional history, I said, was something that's also kind of runs parallel to this project. The Stanford Humanities Laboratory was funded primarily by an investment of the university, as well as, I think, a very visionary investment by a faculty member named Jeffrey Schnapp, who was at the time in comparative literature in French and Italian, to think about collaborative, multi-institutional, big humanities projects. Big humanities projects meaning ones that require teams to unpack, or that they ask questions that were simply too large to be answered by a single person or a single discipline. They took certainly many years to articulate, and often were done in more than one medium. That's, I think, were probably the basis of some of the thinking at the lab. And the idea that it was a lab, a humanities lab. I mean, this is, maybe nowadays it sounds dated, because we think about, I think it's okay to talk about humanities labs in the sense that we have students, faculty, undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs at all levels working together in a laboratory-like setting that's reconfigurable, that people actually are in the same room doing projects that are influencing one another. There's this kind of cross-pollination and so forth. But honestly, even just 10 years ago, this was a fairly radical idea. And at least it hadn't been, even if it wasn't so radical, it was radical institutionally. Let's say there wasn't a lot of precedent at a lot of other institutions of similar type of things. So that the Humanities Lab supported a number of projects, Hypermedia Berlin being one. There was a big project on the history of crowds that Schnapp was behind, which has also gone through a number of iterations as both as a book, as well as a major museum traveling exhibition, as well as spawning many other projects, dissertations, and so forth. And so it was, trying to think beyond kind of departmental or disciplinary silos that so many of these projects often get, unfortunately, stuck in. So that was where the project began. It got to a certain phase in 2005 when I came to UCLA in 2002. And the project, as Hypermedia Berlin, was primarily a teaching platform that was built as I guess I would call it a hypermedia textbook. And just to go back to it, it was a Flash-based system that allowed a certain amount of interactivity for helping students, I guess, to explore Berlin. There were a number of maps, I think there were maybe 30 or so maps. They were manually georeferenced, which meant that I sat there and connected dots together. I was not using GIS at the time, which is essentially a much more robust way for geographers and urban planners to think about spatial analysis. Instead, I was saying, look, the Brandenburg Gate is here in 1936 on this map, and it's here in 1960 on this map, and we're going to connect these two together. And I found about 200 hotspots on all these maps and manually went through the process of georeferencing them. I don't recommend that to anybody. It's a long process, and it doesn't pay off very well. The other thing that we did was we put a database of stuff behind it. The database was marked up by time and space, but not latitude and longitude. It was really just XY coordinates, because these maps were not georeferenced to anything except themselves. So it was a kind of self-referential system. But nevertheless, what you could do is you could click on things and you could get information. They would get photographs and text descriptions, and all the material from my class on the history of Berlin was connected to the site. As students made HTML websites, we connected those too. And so it was kind of it had aspects that you could see to be, incipient in 2005, interesting for participatory humanities scholarship, it was interactive in the sense that students could make choices about what things they clicked on. They could add to the site, although it was a process that wasn't very easy to do. They had to go through some technical people to make sure that their web page was correctly connected to the place that they wanted it and how it would be accessed in a particular time-space junction. But that was, that's where the project, I guess, began. And, again, in thinking about the landscape of digital humanities, it's changed very dramatically, even in the past 5 years, not only in terms of technologies, but also the institutional support and the kind of intellectual questions that could or can be asked. So I'll end that little part there, and I'll bring you to HyperCities. So HyperCities emerged, I guess, around 2005, 2006, in terms of the idea, and all that I said before about the kind of Benjaminian prehistory is still relevant, and it was very much to think about layered times. And it was also to think, well, we don't want to just talk about Berlin. There's plenty of other interesting places in the world besides Berlin. People had been pressing me for a long time, why don't you look at other cities? And I said, I don't have the expertise to look at other cities, but if you do, then you should go forward and do it. And so that was kind of an enlightening thing and really important, that you have to recognize, Hegel once said, it was like the testimony of an educated person, that Bildung is what they don't know. And so I knew very early on that my expertise was fairly limited, and it needed to be an open-ended project. So we needed to involve architects, urban historians, cultural historians, geographers, archaeologists, and historians, all in the mix, in order to begin to articulate these invisible stories, or perhaps stories that have been erased. Sites of erasure and places of memory were very important for the project. And again, it connects in some very fundamental way to Berlin, which is, at least for me, a city that is haunted, is marked by places of erasure. And part of it was trying to just locate things. I mean, part of my project was simply going there in the present and trying to figure out where was that first synagogue in 1719. It's a really interesting story. I found it on a map. I went there and found out that space and began to try to unpack, when was it represented on a map? When did it not become represented? When was it destroyed? And it becomes a whole history of trying to imagine the erased. And you go beyond just, of course, architectural structures. You're also looking at places that are embodied, people that were there, right? Their stories, their voices, their histories. I began to think, wouldn't it be really cool if I could make my family genealogy through time and place? I'd say, look, my grandmother was born right there in 1935, then she moved over here in 1937, then she moved here in 72, and she died in 2007 there. I could begin to track a genealogy. And then I thought, wouldn't it be really cool? We can't quite do this yet, but I mean, this is just kind of like thinking in terms of where the project might have gone. What if you had millions of stories like that? Kind of where people track their own family histories through time and place, and then you have a way of visualizing them. You kind of see all these intersections that you don't know are there. That someone occupied the same time-space junction as you or your family or your brother at some particular very micro moment in time, but then you see these kind of divergences. So the idea of moving diachronically and synchronically was absolutely critical, but not in isolation. It had to begin, you had to connect these stories and histories together. This is something that we can't quite do yet, but it's been kind of like my thinking behind the whole project. Like that really is the essence or the beauty of it, if you could do that. Obviously, a key component that happened in around 2006, 2007 is that mobile devices started to become more ubiquitous and more powerful. That began to really matter because certainly it was information access, retrieval, and participation beyond the desktop. That was a significant kind of turning point in the history of the project.